Okay, I promise that I'm almost done talking about superhero names, okay? One more video though. Hello super friends and welcome back to another episode of Superhero Saturday, where we talk about the arts of superheroes, storytelling, and so much more. Although apparently so much more means talking about naming conventions for 4 weeks in a row. I really promise that next week we'll start getting to other types of content, you know, the and so much more part of my little intro speech. Ah, who am I kidding? I'm never gonna be done talking about superhero names. See, the thing is, I cannot move on to the next video topic until I get all of this stuff out of my head. And that includes naming supervillains as well as naming superheroes. If you have a superhero with a fantastic name and a cryptonym that can stop people in their tracks, but the supervillain's name is Dr. Silly and that's all you got, you might need a little bit more help. That's why today we're going to talk about supervillain naming conventions, because you can follow the same type of rules as I've talked about in my previous videos with the superhero naming conventions, with the team names and what not to do. But there are a few other rules that seem to be kind of part of the style of naming antagonistic characters in the superhero genre. So let's get started. The first and probably most common way to start naming a supervillain type character is to use honorifics. And this is beyond even just the simple Mr. somebody or Mrs. somebody, but in specific villain interpretations, it usually includes some form of academic degree, like doctor or master. This includes characters like Dr. Doom, Doc Ock, Dr. Light, and things like that. It's almost like academia kind of turns people a little crazy. Or they're just so preoccupied with their degree they can't even think about anything else. It's hard work, you know? Once you put in the time and get that PhD, you want to flaunt it, right? Another category of honorifics that seems to be really prevalent in supervillain characters is the use of royal honorifics. That includes things like king and queen and countess and count and those type of words. For example, Count Dracula or Baron Zemo. These characters that want to talk about and highlight their royal heritage might be a little bit preoccupied with the concept of power and authority. So it makes sense that this would find its way into the supervillain's name. These characters could be actual members of the royal family of some kind, or maybe they just used it to describe themselves as being super duper cool. Then when you add whatever their name is at the second half of the name, it makes it a little bit more memorable, a little bit more flavorful. And like always, if you can use assonance and alliteration in your naming schemes, then bonus points. Another extraordinarily typical thing when naming supervillain characters is to denote their sense of evilness by using adjectives, adverbs, and other descriptors to characterize their evilness. These are usually terms that describe strength or mercilessness or moral depravity, toughness, anger, meanness, some kind of threat. These kind of adjectives are great to use when describing your character. For example, your character might be the conqueror, the destroyer, the killer something. This is a great way to combine a few ideas to make something that sounds particularly menacing. One of these types of adjectives is, of course, the use of color, but particular colors for supervillain characters are a lot more prevalent than others. Black, red, green, purple, and orange. For some reason, these colors are really associated with supervillains or antagonists, which you can see in basically any type of villain character, or even in Star Wars, where a red lightsaber means that guy is an automatic bad guy. Even Scar from The Lion King, his normal coloration is kind of orange and black, which is kind of typical for maybe, say, a lion, but when he does his famous be prepared scene, everything goes green and purple, just to emphasize the badness of him with color. If you have any idea about why these colors are so prevalent for evil characters, go ahead and pop those in the comments below, because I'm really not sure why. Another convention for supervillain names, this kind of a subset of the tropes that we've already talked about, is the use of uncommon letters. Particularly letters like Q, X, and Z are used all the time for supervillain names. For example, Dr. X sounds like a really bad guy type of name. I think this kind of draws from a similar type of theme for the other naming conventions, that characters that have names that indicate otherness or something that's less common are outside of the survival group and therefore are considered other and enemy. It's not a great way to start using names and stuff, but it is pretty common in the use of superhero fiction to use these uncommon things to describe characters that are on the borderline of society or fighting against society in general. Another way to incorporate the unusual letters is to kind of translate that into maybe more of a group setting by using an acronym or a few numbers or some kind of serial code. For example, if you want to combine the adjective with the number, you can get a group like the Sinister Six, who are sinister, meaning threatening or menacing, and the number 6, which indicates the number of members on the team. Bonus points for alliteration and assonance. When using things like acronyms, you can also even capitalize on the theme for your supervillain or supervillain team. For example, h.i.v.e, H-I-V-E, incorporates the whole B element into the vibe while actually standing for something else. So it works it in a really creative way and gives you a cohesive theme for this team of supervillains. A continuation of that would be to create a whole kind of evil company that goes along with your supervillain or supervillain team. That could be a company, an Inc., some other kind of organization focused on some kind of capitalistic measures, or something else that binds your team together or supports your supervillain character. A great example of this is, of course, LexCorp or LuthorCorp or whatever iteration is used. In so many different versions of Superman, it's easy to see LexCorp kind of filtering through the background of everything. It's a great way to hide Easter eggs throughout your story, especially if the corporation itself isn't necessarily outright evil. If it's kind of a shell business or some kind of cover for whatever evil machinations are going on, and the hero has to fight against that to get the bad guy, even when the company looks good on the outside, makes it a lot more challenging and kind of interesting to give a little bit of a capitalistic vibe to your supervillain or supervillain team. In the opposite direction, you could also name your supervillain or supervillain team after some kind of animal or animal group, or just give them kind of a theme in general. For example, a character like Killer Croc. You got the killer thing right up front to make sure you absolutely know it's a bad guy. And then the animal itself, the crocodile, is a very vicious carnivore, a predator that is very threatening to common humankind. So making that into a supervillain character, especially if your supervillain has some kind of croc adjacent superpowers, then that would make a really great cohesive theme and a cryptonym to go along with it. You can draw on all sorts of predatorial animals or themes, for example, hurricanes or tornado, anything that's kind of in the natural world that is threatening to humankind, you can turn into a supervillain concept and into your supervillain name. You can also flip the other way and pick something really silly like Killer Moth and kind of go with that. Like, have you seen a moth in real life before, super friends? They're basically less popular versions of butterflies. How much threatening can that thing do to you? Unless, of course, you add the word killer in front of it, then everything's good. But this gives you the option to go into a totally silly direction rather than into, say, a more serious path. The last supervillain naming convention that I have for you is also kind of the most overarching and can go both in the serious direction and in the silly direction, and that is by simply putting something of evil onto the name itself. Anything that denotes some kind of dark, mysterious, evil, threatening type of words, you can just stick it onto either the front end or the back end of your name, and it makes total sense that right away you know this character is a bad guy. For example, the Legion of Doom. The Legion, denoting that it's a group of people, and then of Doom. Doom is usually not a good thing, so I would say that those would probably be bad guys. It is, of course, up to to you to decide whether you want a name that immediately demonstrates the moral alignment of the character or does not. Just like it's up to you to decide whether you want to follow these naming conventions, which have been used over and over again in superhero fiction, or to kind of break outside the norm and pick something a little bit unusual. Either way you shake it, you can pick one of these naming conventions or a bunch, mash and mix them together, and add your own little twist on it to make a supervillain name or supervillain team name that really speaks to the characters themselves and speaks to your own original creation. So there you have it. Those are my supervillain naming conventions. Do you guys have any more supervillain naming conventions out there that you've seen are pretty commonly used? Or even if you have any favorites, go ahead and stick those down in the comments below and we'll continue the conversation there. And thanks so much for watching, Super Friends. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead and give us a big thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more superheroic content every single Saturday. And more than just naming conventions, I promise, so we'll get to some other things. And if you would like to support the team, you can follow us on social media or go over to our Patreon page, where you can get behind the scenes content, merchandise, and books just by supporting us over there. And if you'd like to see my own supervillains in action, you can go to our website at www.fearless9.com, where you pick up some books that might just contain your new favorite characters. Thanks again for watching, Super Friends, and we'll see you next week.